Alrighty, then we'll get into it. So this week is about the cortex. Yes, I did. Thank you.
Fair question.
I have another reminder coming up. Let me double check. That was mentioned.
Oh wow.
Main point one, turn on the mic.
Yes, okay, it's on. So this is where the magic happens. I think I've said that before. Yeah.
I just have a quick question. So
It's too late.
Okay, that's why I'm moving to it. I'm over it. But if you want to answer it, are we like expected to know these areas and where they are? There's a lot of them.
I'd say very roughly.
Okay, that's fine.
If you know it to the degree that I tell you in this talk,
Okay,
then you're fine.
deal.
And as far as like Brodmann areas go, they're a little flexible, you know, because we're all a bit different from one another, and it's more about function than precise location, and location can change,
Okay.
as we'll see. But the general area won't change. Your motor cortex is always going to be in the precentral gyrus. Now, that contralateral innervation can actually differ. One side can move over to the other. I know. But it's still going to be in the same gyrus. It's still going to be just ahead of
Right,
your
okay,
central sulcus there. So if you got that the motor cortex is in the frontal lobes, in the most posterior portion of it, great.
Okay, cool. That's fine.
Okay. And I think that'll be good enough.
Okay,
We just want to have a broad idea of where these are. Motor is not back here.
got it. I can handle that.
And then somatosensory just behind it. Vision is back here. Broad distinctions are good enough. It's not good enough if you're going to go into neurosurgery. There you might want to know. But they always have to check. You know, you always have to do a little bit of testing to make sure you're in the right spot because we're all so different from one another. We got a general idea of where things are, but the precise location always comes down to the individual.
Okay.
Because there's flexibility in where stuff lies. And cells can change what they respond to. If you lose input, you have two choices. Change what you listen to or die. And the option that's picked most of the time is change what you listen to. Because the pathways that we talked about, they're not really as specific as they're laid out. That specificity comes from inhibitory neurons that we will talk about in this lecture. They help focus that input. But the kind of sloppy nature of axonal projections is kind of a good thing because you have that flexibility. What if you lose a finger? You don't want all those cortical neurons to go to waste, so the sloppy projections, well, now they have a function. Now those neighboring projections that are heading into the cortical area responsive to this digit, now they can actually stimulate those cortical neurons because this input is lost. So the lateral inhibition is relieved. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We're going to get into that in this first part here. The second part is going to be over some different cortical areas. I want to talk about vision because it's fairly important to us. I'd say it guides most of our actions. We use it to gather a lot of information. You all read before you came here, right?
Absolutely.
There you go. And that visual input can teach you a lot. You get a lot from vision. You can look at someone and kind of tell how they feel. Yeah, we're all feeling pretty good. Somatosensation is also important, especially for you all. Pain sucks. We want to help folks with pain. So we'll talk a bit about how we, or the brain areas involved with somatosensation, with perceiving where your body is in space, and some of the association areas that help guide movement. And then we'll end with movement. There's about 3 areas that you should be familiar with that we'll collectively call the motor cortex. There's your primary motor cortex, supplementary motor area, and premotor cortex. And they have slightly different functions that we'll hit right at the end. But in all cases of the cortex, what we're doing is building on simpler knowledge. And that's really what we're doing in life too. You know, before you learn all these nifty words that we're learning right now, you learn simpler words. You have to learn your alphabet before you learn how to spell those words. So it's integrating simpler information to create a more complex picture. And that's what our cortex does too. The primary cortices are going to have very granular information that they respond to. What's the angle of the line? Does it end? Does it keep going? What's the color of this little tiny area? Or what am I feeling just right here? What am I feeling here? And then I'll see, well, what am I feeling with all the neighbors? By taking into account the angle of all these joints, I can have a rough idea what the size of this thing is without actually looking at it. But I can't do that with a single perceptive area. I got to build on simpler knowledge. I know I'm encountering an object with all of my fingers. I know they're about that far apart. That gives me an idea of the size here. That's fairly complicated though. So we're going to have simpler units working together to create that idea. And that's what the cortex is all about. Creating these columns. Microphone's on. We create these columns that respond to one specific area, whether it's of our visual field, one specific frequency, or one specific part of our body, and they encode every possible state that could be occurring in that little area of our receptive field. And by putting a bunch of columns together, we can create a more complete picture of what's going on right now. These columns are all going to have different layers. They all have the same layers though. So no matter where you are in the neocortex, you're going to have 6 layers, and they're all going to have the same types of cells there with the same patterns of projections. Here's our 6 layers here. The first one doesn't really have a whole lot of neurons in it. It's going to be a lot of neurites, so there'll be dendrites, there'll be axons, there'll be some glia there. Neurons we're going to find in these other layers here. There's a few scattered in here, but for the most part, you're going to just find neurites and glia. Moving a little bit below layer 1, so this is the most superficial layer. Layers 2 and 3 are going to be our external layers. They're going to have either granule or smaller neurons or pyramidal neurons. And these have cell bodies that kind of look like a triangle, so we call them pyramidal. They look kind of like a pyramid. They're a little bit larger. They're not as big as the layer 5 neurons. These are actually the largest, but they are bigger than the granule cells. When you hear granule, you should be thinking small, remain local. These are going to be local circuit neurons. Your pyramidal neurons are going to project. Layers 4 and 5, these are the inner layers. Again, granule and pyramidal. And layer 6 is what we call multiform, because we find a mixture of neurons here. Not just small, not just large, but a mix of the two. So the size of the neurons that are in them can help us distinguish these different layers. Either we have none, some small ones, some big ones, some small ones, some big ones, and then a mix. There you get your 6 layers. The pattern of connection here is also consistent between different cortical areas for all of these layers. The input is, for the most part, going to come from the cortex. We have some thalamic input in layers 1 and 4 for our matrix and core projections, but everything else is getting input from the cortex. And this is how we're building on those smaller bits of information, so that based on what's going on in all my different fingers, I can tell what's going on in my hand. It's cortical connections. Different parts of the cortex talking to each other, or those different parts of your visual cortex constructing shapes from simple lines. In order to do that, they have to talk. So you can see the input in nearly all of these layers is going to include the cortex, except layer 4. This is coming from the thalamus. So here's how we get our, not so much primary, but pretty close, secondary or tertiary sensory input. So we actually get input from the retina or from the skin. Of course, not directly, it has to come from the thalamus. This input is going to kind of spread within that same area of the cortex. Layers 2 and 3 are going to connect to other cortical hemispheres. So these will be your commissural axons that will cross over. Some will also stay within the same cortical hemisphere, but for the most part, these are going to come from layer 4 here. Layers 5 and 6, notice they're further down, so it makes sense for these to project downward. And that's what they're going to do. Layer 6 is going to project to the thalamus. So this forms that thalamo-cortical loop. Layer 4 gets the input. There's a bit of processing going on in the cortex. And then layer 6 provides feedback back to the thalamus. Layer 5, which has our largest pyramidal neurons, these are going to project everywhere else. If it's outside the cortex and the thalamus, layer 5. So this is a pretty simple distinction there. So your corticospinal tract, for example, layer 5. Projections to the basal ganglia, layer 5. Anything that's not the cortex or the thalamus is coming from layer 5. So depending on the area of the cortex that we're talking about, these different layers are going to have different thicknesses because different parts of the cortex do different things. Some areas are very much involved with creating these long-distance subcortical projections, like your primary motor cortex. Comparing that to just a prefrontal association cortex, where we integrate multi-sensory information to create a unified vision of now. So your current conscious perception is going to be created more in your prefrontal association cortex. The biggest areas here are really going to be those involved with intracortical communication. Not so much layer 5. When you compare the relative size of layer 5 here, much larger in your motor cortex. And that makes sense. The job of your motor cortex is to innervate lower motor neurons, which are of course located outside the thalamus and cortex. So this layer has to expand because we just simply have a greater number of projection neurons. We have more targets. But those that are communicating more with the rest of the cortex, those are going to have expansion of those layers. So they'll shrink layer 5 a bit. So their job isn't to innervate subcortical areas. They're all about those cortical-cortical connections. So we got a few different layers, and it's consistent with the size of cells that you see there and the pattern of input. For the most part, everything's coming from the cortex, except for in layers 1 and 4 where we get that thalamic input. The output, for the most part, is going to be the cortex, except for layers 5 and 6. Sometimes. The organization of the cortex is those 6 layers, and neurons within the same little area across all layers are going to be responsive pretty much to the same type of information. We have what we call cortical columns. So if you were to pierce and go from layer 1 all the way down to layer 6, for example in the visual cortex, you'd find that every neuron there is responsive to pretty much the same area of your visual field. So all neurons in that column are responsive to the same area, whether it's of your skin, visual field, doesn't matter. They're going to do slightly different things, they have different connectivity, but they're all dealing with the same type of information. In that little spot of your retina, what's going on? We're going to have different neurons that are responsive to different angles, as we'll see. So depending on which neurons within the column are active, that's going to help us determine what are we seeing. There's going to be communication between these columns so we can build up what's going on in different parts of our retina so we can get an idea of what am I seeing in my entire visual field. But no matter where you are in the cortex, the basic functional unit is a cortical column. And there's going to be stepwise building between columns to create a larger picture. Individual cortical neurons deal with very granular information. So within each column, we're going to have those distinct layers here. And within each column, we're going to have both excitatory and inhibitory neurons. So those clean layers that we talked about there, the granule and the pyramidal neurons, for example, those are all excitatory neurons. The granule cells, sometimes also called stellate cells because they kind of look like stars rather than pyramids. Those are going to stay local, and the pyramidal neurons are going to project. They'll either project within the cortex if they're up there in layer 3, for example, or they'll project downward if they're layer 5. but pyramidal projects and stellate stays local. So the stellate neurons are going to be involved with exciting neurons within the same column. For example, those stellate neurons in layer 4, they receive input from the thalamus. That thalamic input is then going to be spread between neurons in different layers through projections from these layer 4 stellate cells. So they'll take that one excitatory input and spread it to neighboring neurons in different layers. So even though we get thalamic input to layer 4, it's going to affect neurons in other layers as well, because we have those excitatory interneurons. We also have inhibitory interneurons. And this is probably really where the magic happens. Throughout evolution, this is the group that's expanded far more than excitatory neurons. Humans have a greater number and diversity of inhibitory neurons, and because they're really involved with the computations here. Excitatory neurons are just a simple relay. If I'm excited, I excite my neighbor, and then they excite their downstream target. And that's great, so that we can have upper motor neurons stimulating lower motor neurons, stimulating muscle. But the more complex aspects of brain function probably involve creating these logical circuits that our interneurons, more precisely inhibitory interneurons, do. They're going to do really two things for us, both of which are inhibition. They're going to provide lateral inhibition, and then they're going to provide feed-forward inhibition. So we're going to be inhibiting across space and time. Their job is to help focus that input to specific neurons within a single column. Because different neurons within a column are going to respond to different types of input, whether it's, let's say, gentle deformation of the skin or more pronounced deformation, vibration, or different angles of lines. How do I distinguish this angle from this angle? Well, certain neurons are going to be more active at this angle, others will be more active at this angle, and only the most active neurons will be allowed to communicate with their downstream targets through lateral inhibition. This works just like it did everywhere else. We just raise the bar for how much excitation you need to communicate with your postsynaptic partner. Because axon projections are not as clean as they are in the cartoon world. There's always a bit of spreading of the axon. They don't hit just one cell. So to make sure that only the most strongly innervated cell is stimulated, we have lateral inhibition. And there's a variety of interneurons I described briefly in the notes. They're going to be scattered throughout different layers. They're going to have slightly different targets. For example, your somatostatin positive neurons are mostly going to get input from pyramidal cells. So if this cell is strongly activated, what it does is stimulate this local interneuron that then inhibits all the neighbors. So if you're not strongly innervated, you're silenced. And this creates a cleaner distinction between which neurons are receiving input. Yeah?
Is it inhibiting itself too? It looks like it.
It's inhibiting an inhibitor of itself. So it's actually promoting its excitation in that case. About this right here.
No, the one that's going back up to the one that's not grayed out.
Oh, yes. So how does this one know where it got its input from? Because there's going to be input from all the neighbors. So there's going to be inhibition coming back here. So you have to have enough excitatory input to overcome that. So same thing as everywhere else. Only the strongly excited are going to hit threshold, conduct action potentials, and communicate with their partner. And so yes, they will inhibit themselves. Then there are other neurons that are going to be recruited at the same time as their target. This is feed-forward inhibition. Let's look at this a little bit here. Actually, let's make sure we describe this before we move ahead. So, for example, input from the thalamus. This is going to target layer 4 neurons. Some of them are going to be inhibitory. Some will be excitatory. What these inhibitory neurons are going to do is decrease the window of excitation. Because remember, neurons that fire together, yeah, exactly. What we need to do is make sure that they're actually firing together. That they really are active at the same time. And to restrict that window, So only when things actually occur together, we get this feed-forward inhibition. So excitatory input excites this excitatory projection neuron, and also this inhibitory interneuron. So what we're seeing here, blue is going to be activity of the inhibitory neuron, and here's our excitatory outputs. We can see the effect of just excitation and excitation with inhibition. Notice the difference in timing. So by providing that slightly delayed GABAergic input, because what's going to happen here, we get excitation here and here simultaneously. So this is first excited, then there's a bit of a delay because we have two synapses, not just one. Excitation followed by inhibition. So that we have restricted excitation. So that if we have decoupled excitatory input, these things are not happening together. These three different excitatory inputs to this one neuron we're reporting from are happening at different times. They're each causing their feed-forward inhibition. You'll notice these don't really build on one another because they're not happening at the same time. Without this feed-forward inhibition, they would just build on each other and raise us to threshold. Only whenever we have precisely timed excitatory input can they build and hit threshold, because we've restricted this temporal window for integration. So in order for cells to wire together, they have to actually fire together, not just close enough to together. So this increases the frequency with which our cortical neurons can act. Now that single input doesn't last as long, so it can respond to an additional number of inputs in a given period of time. So this speeds up activity in our cortex, which is probably why, or at least one of the reasons why, we're so much smarter than other animals. We have these inhibitory interneurons, or at least more of them, that kind of supercharge our cortex, so it can operate at a higher frequency. That's what it's doing there. And make sure that we don't create improper associations. You have to actually fire together. So there's a couple things that these are going to do. Inhibit across space, so only the most strongly excited are going to hit threshold, and inhibit across time, so that only paired input will get summed together. And if there's any distinction in their timing, they don't sum. We get that quick inhibition right afterward. Different parts of the cortex are going to be linked together through association fibers and commissural fibers. The association fibers are going to link ipsilateral regions of the cortex so that we can integrate multiple senses. For example, right now you have a unified sense of what's going on. It doesn't feel like your visual system is different from your auditory system. You look at me, my mouth is moving, you hear the words, you feel stuff at the same time. It's happening in different areas of the cortex, but it all gets linked together through these association fibers. Association fibers can be very local, so that the two wrinkles or the two gyri next to each other are linked. There'll be these little U-shaped bundles here, linking them together. This might link your motor and somatosensory cortices, for example, so they can communicate with one another. We also have what we call neighborhood fibers. They're a little bit longer. And then there's the long association fibers that act over greater distances, like this arcuate fasciculus here that links the front and the back of the cortex. So there's different types of association fibers, but they all do the same thing. Link together cortical areas within the same hemisphere. Those that link other sides of the hemispheres are called commissural fibers. And there's a few of these. They're commissural fibers that link together the fornix from each hippocampus so that our two hippocampal complexes can work together. The easiest to see is, of course, the corpus callosum. That's this big white matter bundle here. So these axons are going to link different hemispheres with one another. And it works from the frontal lobes all the way back to the occipital lobes. And there's, of course, an organization to this. different parts of the corpus callosum here. So here's where our brain would be. Here's the front. Here's the occipital lobe. Those areas that are in the more frontal regions are going to be in the front of your corpus callosum here. And those that are more in occipital regions are going to hit the back. So we got our rostrum down here, the genu called the knee, I suppose. That's where it bends. There's the large body. It's going to have motor and sensory input here. And then there's the splenium, which kind of hangs off in the more occipital regions. It's going to have visual input. And this allows the two sides of your brain to communicate with one another. Because you should remember that your left visual field goes to your right occipital lobe, and your right visual field goes to the left. Now, of course, we see this all as one unified vision. You don't see it as two separate visual fields because they get linked together via the corpus callosum. So the two sides of your brain can operate together. And when this gets severed, which sometimes it does, usually through surgery, the two hemispheres don't work together. And you can have them actually fighting with one another. Have I showed you Joe, the split brain patient yet? All right, well, we'll get to that on Monday then. So they severed his corpus callosum to stop the spread of seizures from one hemisphere to the other. And you know, on occasion his hands will compete with one another. I don't want to spoil it, but it can create what we call alien hand syndrome, where you don't really have as good control over one hand. Maybe you're trying to button your shirt with one and the other's undoing it, or you're trying to make an omelet and the other hand's throwing utensils in it. So they have to work together, and the reason that our two sides can't work together so well is this very large fiber bundle called the corpus callosum. So we got communication within the hemispheres, we have communication between the hemispheres, and that's what really is going to allow the magic to happen. Everything that's going on in your cortex gets integrated. So you get a unified now, not a bunch of disparate nows where there's senses acting independent of one another. They all work together. Do we have any questions? All right, I do. Let's review these. All right, let's talk a little bit about sensory perception and the motor areas of the cortex. We're going to kind of breeze through these a little bit. We're going to start with vision. We'll move on to somatosensation. And these work together. We don't just use vision to read things. We use it to guide our movements and to help us figure out what stuff is. And we do that with touch, too. That helps guide our movements and figure out what stuff is. So these senses are never going to act just in isolation. That's why we have association cortices. So when you think of the cortex, I'd like you to think of primary areas as dealing with very granular information. What are all the letters, for example? And the association areas are going to put together those letters to make words, and put together those words to make sentences, and link together those sentences to make ideas. So we're building on smaller information. And in the primary cortices, that's the most granular information you could imagine. We'll start off with visions. The primary visual cortex is back there in the occipital lobes. You can call it V1, that works. If you like Brodmann areas, it's 17. It's not super useful. The only one I remember is 312. That's about it. The area code in Chicago.
Area 51.
What's that?
That Area 51.
I don't know where that is. I mean, I know it like in real life.
I don't know where that is either.
So in the primary visual cortex, we have neurons that are going to respond to very specific types of information. A very narrow range of frequencies of light, so specific colors, for example. We haven't quite figured out the hue yet. That's going to be down the road. But we're getting input from our color opponent neurons, at least if we're getting input down here in these layers. Angles of lines. There are going to be neurons that are going to be active with very precise angles. Only this will strongly stimulate me. This, a little less, little less, little less. Now I don't respond at all. Okay, now we're back a little bit. Oh yeah, this is where I want it. Just like that. Very granular information. Is something moving? If it is, which direction? I will only respond to you if I see something moving from left to right. I won't do it from right to left. Up and down, no. Only left to right. Very specific movement. So we're just looking at the letters. We're not actually picking out any words yet. That's going to be down the road. Down the road, we're going to put that together. So here we can see the response for different angles of lines. So what they do is project different angles onto the retina while they're recording in the primary visual cortex here. The purpose of this, they were going to do some cytotoxic lesions in the cortex, so they had to insert a little electrode there before they did that lesion, and while they were doing that, they recorded. So they're not moving between the layers. What they're doing here is moving between the columns. So they're moving within columns and between columns. So they're moving within layers. So you can see the path here. Here's the surface. Here's layers 2, 3, 4, 5 down here. 4 is the biggest here, obviously, because of the substantial thalamic input that we're getting. So 4 is expanded in our primary visual cortex, and that'll shrink down as we move into associational areas. But 4 is pretty big. Now as they're moving across, so within the same layer, you'll notice that the response is going to change. Which angle do I respond to? As they move and encounter different neurons, they respond to different angles. What they get is essentially this 360-degree rotation as they're moving within the same cortical column, where up here we're responsive to -60 and down here -60. Every angle in between is represented as they encounter different neurons. As they then move into a different column, we're again getting at 360-degree. But we're responsive to single orientations here, not multiple. Very granular information. We're going to integrate those. What sort of angles did I see? Because neurons that are next to each other in the primary visual cortex are responsive to areas of the retina that were next to each other. So if two of our columns next to one another are showing us that we have this angle and this angle, well, we can put that together. We're probably looking at that. We'll put those together, make shapes. Right, if we have other nearby columns, we can put all of them together and start to make shapes. Within our primary visual cortex, many of the cells are going to be what I've just described there. Just simple cells that respond to lines, and they have that surround inhibition, just like we saw in the retina. So what we've done here is sum the activity of multiple retinal ganglion cells via the thalamus. But that pattern right there, where you have a single line, and only when it's in the center, if you move it a bit, we're going to get inhibition. You can create that by summing together multiple retinal ganglion cells, putting together their receptive fields. I guess I'm probably putting some more here. That's going to create lines that we respond to, not dots anymore, but lines. As we move away from that, we're going to enter the surround of their receptive field, and we'll get inhibition. And that's what most of our primary visual cortex neurons are going to pick up. Very simple details like that. Some are going to be a little more complex, and by complex we just mean that there's no surround inhibition. These cells have lost that. Hypercomplex, meaning they have inhibition, but it's not surround. It's a much more complicated receptive field. These have an inhibitory region and an excitatory region that usually butts up to it, so they're going to tell us where lines end. It's not as simple as just saying there's a line at what angle. It has to be a line at a certain angle, and it has to stop within its receptive field. So the activity of all of these neurons are going to help us determine what shapes. By putting together shapes, colors, we can determine objects. But that's going to occur far outside the primary visual cortex. There we're starting to put together our letters and make words. This is going to occur in association regions. So here's our primary visual cortex right here. There's going to be stepwise integration of these neurons. So in the retina, we're responsive to a very small area and just points of light. We turn those points into lines, we turn those lines into shapes, those shapes into objects, such as faces, for example. We'll take that broad range of colors that our options are responsive to, we'll cut it down with color opponency. We'll continue to cut it down through integration in our primary and secondary visual cortices to determine the exact hue. And then there's two paths that we're going to be taking here. One is going to be a little more medial and inferior. We call it the ventral stream. The other one's going to go on the lateral portion and superior. It's going to be the dorsal stream. The ventral stream is going to hit the temporal lobes. Temporal lobes, we should be thinking memory. So what is this object? So this is the what pathway. So the ventral stream, by hitting the temporal lobes and the limbic structures underneath, we can recall our memories to determine what is this object. So we put together within our primary and secondary visual cortices here, kind of what's the color, what's the shape, but what's the precise object? Am I looking at my mother or am I looking at some other lady? I'm going to figure that out elsewhere. There are certain areas of the brain that can be responsive only whenever we see faces or things kind of similar to faces, for example. So as you move away from the primary cortex, you're responding to more complex but more specific information. So only faces, for example, will be active in certain areas. So we move down, we're still in the visual cortex here where we're actually determining our colors, the object that we're looking at, and then we can recognize specific objects by moving forward. Am I looking at a guitar? Is it my guitar? What kind of guitar is it? That's going to be outside in the temporal lobes. We're going to be hitting the perihippocampal gyrus. We're going to be hitting that piriform cortex. Of course, underlying that, we have the amygdala and the hippocampus. Here's where we get our recognition. So here's the basic circuit for the ventral stream. Here's the dorsal that we'll get to next. So we got our visual cortices here, primary. So what are the letters? Or I guess, what are the angles of lines? Here's where we make our letters, then we start to make words, and now let's see, what's the sentence? Let's put it all together. So we're hitting the temporal lobes here, we're going to hit the perihippocampal gyrus, entorhinal cortex, hippocampus, and this will help us determine, what is this? I've learned that this is a laser pointer. So when I look at this, I can tell that's a laser pointer. I remember that. I can tell it's my laser pointer. You give me another one that looks just like it. I don't have the same emotional response. This gets me all worked up. But you need that emotional response to really show familiarity. When you have damage along this portion of your visual pathway, for example, you get the Capgras syndrome, the Capgras delusion, where, man, that looks just like my mother, but it's not her, it's an imposter, because I don't have that emotional response. Looks just like my laser pointer, this is an imposter. Because we don't have that emotional response. That's what tells us we are familiar with this. I recognize it, and I'm familiar with it. So we're going to hit that limbic system by going ventrally. We'll hit the temporal lobes and limbic structures. At the same time, we're also determining where is this object. So another thing to keep in mind with the cortex is that we have all these parallel processes operating at the same time and independently. After we figure out the granular information and a general idea of what am I kind of looking at in the visual cortex, then we figure out what is it specifically with the ventral path and where is it with the dorsal path here. So we still have our visual cortices here. We're going to project on upward into the parietal lobes. So on the other side of the brain, so now we're a little more lateral and we're heading upward. Here's where we're going to figure out where is the object. So we're going to be hitting the parietal lobes. The parietal lobes are very important for spatial relationships, whether it's on your body or for things you're seeing. The parietal lobe deals with spatial information, among other things. So we're going to go a little more laterally. We'll hit other visual cortices here, and then we're out into association areas in the parietal lobe. Areas 5 and 7 are going to come up again whenever we talk about somatosensation. Here's your somatosensory cortex. So the site between them, we're going to be integrating that type of information, visual and more location-based information. So we're going to go from the visual cortex on up into our parietal cortex. This is going to help guide our movements, because we're going to project from here into motor areas, including the primary motor cortex, and then eye fields. So we're going to be able to move our limbs and our eyes as we're tracking objects. That object tracking is going to take place via the dorsal stream here. So as we're watching an object, we can tell when it's moving, and based on that movement, we're going to help guide the movement of our limbs and eyes, depending on if we want to reach out and grab something. Even if it's moving, we can still reach out and grab stuff. And we do that simply by tracking it and allowing that tracking to then guide motor output. So for what, head to the temporal lobes, access memory structures. For the where, head into the parietal lobes, where we deal more with spatial information. Now we also have input to these regions, these parietal association regions, from the pulvinar nucleus. So not all of it has to come from the lateral geniculate. Recall that we're going to have that offshoot as we're going through the optic tracts to the lateral geniculate. There's a bit of an offshoot that hits the pulvinar nucleus. This might be what creates blind sight, where individuals who are blind due to damage to the cortex, to the visual cortex, even though they can't actually see anything, they can localize objects in space. So here's a gentleman who's had cortical damage. Although he can't see anything, if you were to hold it up and say, what is this? He can't tell what objects are, but he can tell where objects are because of that input that's preserved from the pulvinar. So his retina still works. The problem is his primary visual cortex doesn't work. So he doesn't recognize lines, letters, words, anything like that. But he can see where things are. And he can avoid trash cans, tripods, things like that. Even though he can't see them, he can still localize them in space and use that to guide his movements. Pretty nifty stuff. So continuing our movement in the parietal lobe, we're going to encounter our primary somatosensory cortex. Here's where we have our body map. So Brodmann areas 3, 1, 2, going from front to back there. We have a map of the body, and it's as orderly as one could expect. So we have this somatotopic map. Of course, it's not this focused, right? Stimulation of our face, it's going to branch out. It's actually going to hit hand regions. But it won't stimulate them because of that lateral inhibition. It's going to be weak input. And because we still have our hand, and we're always feeling our hand, we're always having stronger input here and focusing it through lateral inhibition. So the cleanliness of this map is only true so long as we have all of these afferents to focus through lateral inhibition. When we lose that strong input, neurons are going to respond to the weaker. That strong thalamic input that's coming from our hand, for example, is not going to stimulate the local inhibitory interneurons, and it's not going to shunt that weaker input from, let's say, the face. So when we lose input here, we can see reorganization of our somatotopic map. What they did here was clip off digit 3 in an owl monkey. They did this in several monkeys. And they just mapped the responsiveness. First they made the map before clipping off the digits 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are all next to each other, just like they are in the hand. When you lose digit 3, then we can see this takeover. Notice the size of digits 2 and 4. Their maps, which are flanking 3, spread in. So we lose that lateral inhibition. So this area, which used to be strongly stimulated by afferents from the 3rd digit, they've lost that. They've lost that strong input. They've lost the lateral inhibition that creates when that input arrives. And as such, that focusing is lost. The weaker afferents that were always coming in from digits 2 and 3 are now disinhibited. So they can stimulate the neurons there. So when there's stimulation of that 2nd digit, neurons here can respond. They're not getting that constant input from the 3rd digit anymore because it's gone. By losing that and losing the lateral inhibition, you see a lack of focusing and you see takeover. This can occur throughout. And the larger the rearrangement, if you lose more than, let's say, just a digit, if you lose a whole limb, the lower you're likely to see that rearrangement. For example, in the cuneate nucleus versus just in the cortex. So everywhere, brainstem on up, you can see this takeover. Because we always use lateral inhibition to focus the kind of sloppy axonal projections that we have. We can then make those weak inputs much stronger. Of course, we'll have a little LTP. We can increase the strength of them. Now that they are actually firing together, they'll wire together and preserve that input. We can create additional synapses. There'll be some local sprouting of axons, so those relatively few weak synapses will multiply in number, and that will increase the strength of input from digit 2 to these neurons. It used to respond to digit 3. Since it's lost, they have to find something else to respond to. So we've got 3, 1, 2. Here's our primary somatosensory cortex. As you move from 3 to 1 to 2, you're going to be building from very small granular information to slightly more elaborate information. The receptive fields of the neurons increases in size as a result because they're integrating input from one another, just like we were doing there in the striate cortex. So those simple, small, circular receptive fields kind of stretched out and elongated to form linear receptive fields. So neurons in area 3, for example, respond to much smaller areas of the skin. You move on to 1 and 2, and now we're dealing with multiple digits. So we're not just worried about what's happening here. Really what we want to do is worry about what's happening, of course, everywhere. What's happening in my hand? Am I holding a laser pointer or a key? I won't figure that out in area 3. I'll figure out what's going on in each individual area, and they will all communicate and integrate more in area 2. So the initial input is mostly going to come from the thalamus to area 3. Some will also hit 1 and 2, but most of it comes to 3. 3 then goes to 1, 2. So we're going to be building. Again, we start with letters, then we build words. So a lot of the input is going to come from the thalamus there. There's, of course, input within the same somatosensory cortex, so that building from 3 to 1 to 2. Contralateral input as well, so the two sides of your body can work together. So there's input from the somatosensory cortex to itself, both ipsilaterally and contralaterally. So we'll have our local association fibers, and we'll have those commisual fibers that go through the corpus callosum linking to the two sides of the brain there. And then there are back and forth projections with the motor cortex. Because we're always making predictions. And this is part of that prediction. So I made the plan to move my arm forward. Did it actually happen? That feedback can come from our somatosensory cortex back to the motor cortex. Yeah, your arm is now straight. Yes, you're holding the laser pointer. And that can help refine those predictive circuits and refine our motor programs through this input. You thought you were going to move forward, but you didn't. You moved a little further to the right. So that program is incorrect. let's fix it. Cerebellum is going to help with that. So input from the motor to somatosensory is going to say, here's what is about to happen, get ready. And what that will actually do is prime the neurons in the somatosensory cortex so that they're a little more excitable as a result. For example, when you know you're planning to feel around and find something in the dark, you can increase the excitability of your somatosensory neurons through this input as well. There's also that gating in hypothalamus too. There's many areas where we can affect their excitability. So there's predictive association, there's feedback association, but your motor and somatosensory cortices are always talking to one another because they're so intimately linked in terms of their function. How you move your body affects proprioception. And that proprioceptive feedback helps you refine your motor circuits. So there's a back and forth here just within the cortex. We're also going to move outside of our primary somatosensory cortex, of course, into association regions. They're going to help us with our reaching task, so that area 5 and 7. They're coming up again. So that we had our dorsal stream here, so visual input is going to hit areas 5 and 7. So is somatosensory input. So we know where our limb is because we can feel it, we can also see it, of course, and we can see where the object is. So that'll help guide our movements. And then in area 7, we can actually start to determine what am I feeling. So if you were to put something in your hand and try to feel around, is it a pencil, is it a pen, laser pointer? That's not going to happen in your primary somatosensory cortex so much. It's going to happen outside that in association regions. That's where we'll put together input from additional areas so that the entire hand can be taken into account. What am I feeling everywhere on here, not just the individual digits. The motor areas are going to be a little more anterior here. So we started in the back and we've made our slow trot forward. Now we're in the frontal lobes. So what separates your parietal and frontal lobes there is that central sulcus. In the parietal portion, we have our somatosensory cortex. In the frontal lobes, we have our motor cortex, primary motor cortex. These are right next to each other, so those local association fibers allow them to communicate. Their body maps line up pretty well. So the areas that are responsive to input at the fingers are going to be near motor neurons that innervate the fingers, while the lower motor neurons that hit the fingers. So their maps line up, and this way those association fibers make sense. When you're making predictive movements about the hand, you're communicating with the nearby hand neurons. So the primary motor cortex is going to be organized not around muscles, but around movements. Which direction do I want to move my finger? I want to move it that way, this way. That's what the neurons respond to, not individual muscles. I want to move my hand forward, or maybe left, or right, or back. That's what they're going to be responsive to, not individual muscles. So what they're doing in this experiment, they had the monkey hold on to this little bar here, and they're going to move it in different directions. Forward, left, right. And they're reporting from individual neurons in the primary motor cortex. They give them a little instructional cue to say move, and then we can see fairly silent when moving this way, 180 degrees away from that, most active. Move a little bit away, yeah, they're still active, not quite as much as they were here. Move a little bit away, not quite as active until we get silence here. So this neuron is most responsive to rightward movements. This period here, this is just noise. Neurons are never truly completely silent, so there's always a little bit of output there, but you see the most output whenever we have movement in this direction. This is largely what our primary motor neurons are dealing with, the direction of movement for a specific body part. They can work together in groups to make more complex movements like this. And they're going to form the majority of our cortical spinal tract. The primary somatosensory cortex forms some of that too. The premotor and supplementary motor areas will contribute fibers as well. But the majority of cortical spinal output is going to come from the primary motor cortex there. There's two other motor areas, and here's how I want you to think of them. The premotor cortex is going to be for externally guided movements, based on visual input, for example. Whereas the supplementary motor area is going to be more for internally guided movements, so your memory, for example. So here they're doing recordings from individual neurons in the premotor cortex. And what they've done is train the monkeys to move the bar, in this case left. So they give them an instructional tone here that says you're going to move to the left, and then there's a second tone that says carry out the movement. So one tells them what to do, and then the other says now execute it. So it's a delayed response paradigm here. They tell them what to do, and they must wait. They must hold that action in their head, and the place where they seem to hold it is the premotor cortex. Because when you see, after they tell them, move left, these neurons are active up until the point where they then trigger the movement and carry out. And after it's done, back to silence. Well, silence. And they hold that plan until it's carried out. So as they delay the tone, here they play the tone earlier, middle, and longer. So they increase the delay, and as they increase the delay in these different timings here, those neurons remained active the entire time until they actually carried it out. So that externally guided movement, where they get the tone to say move left, that's going to stimulate neurons in the premotor cortex that then hold this plan until they know to carry it out. Then premotor neurons are going to stimulate primary motor neurons. Then we get output in the cortical spinal tract, we carry out the movement to the left. Movement to the right, for this same neuron, you'll actually see silence until they carry it out. So different premotor neurons are going to be involved with different types of actions. Some will be involved with moving a limb to the left, others to the right. So there's quite a bit of specificity here. But what we're doing here is holding a plan in our head. And it's a plan based on external input. Here's the reason why we think of these distinctions. What they've done in this experiment is teach a monkey to press 3 buttons in a certain order. And what they're doing is showing it with visual input. You ever play Simon? Is that the name of the game? No. What the hell is that? You know, they got the colored buttons. What is that? I think so too. Thanks. Yeah. So it's not Simon Says. Simon doesn't actually say. Simon flashes the color, and you press like red, and then it goes red, green. You go red, green, and
Twist it.
Yeah.
Red.
Oh, yeah, just like
So, okay, same shit. So, 3 buttons here. Colored lights. Colored lights.
I'm sorry.
It's still been around though.
I believe you.
Yeah. I wasn't playing it at -7. So the visual cue here, they just light up those buttons. It's externally guided movements. Internal is they've learned that sequence. They don't flash the lights anymore. Now they rely on the memory of the order. They have to remember the order. Individual neurons in the primary motor cortex, just as active in both cases. We're pressing 1, 2, 3 buttons. They're just as active whether you're flashing the light or it's internally guided. Either way, you have to have cortical spinal tract output. That's what these create. So they're active in both cases. A bit of a different story whenever we move on to the premotor cortex. Most of the activity we're seeing is when it's visually guided, when they're flashing the lights and we're using that external input to guide our movement. But once they've learned the order, not a whole lot of activity here. And this is, of course, flipped in our supplementary motor area, where we kind of store this pattern. So your memory of what to do is going to be here. So when they have to recall that pattern on their own, that's when we see activity in our supplementary motor area. That's because it's internally guided there. So we're recalling up the learned order. But while they're flashing the lights, not as much activity as when it's internally guided. So these are quite similar. They're both going to help us create a certain pattern of movement by communicating with the primary motor cortex. But what are they dealing with? If it's sensory input, that's more the premotor cortex. And this is much larger. And a lot of our movement is based on sensory input. The internally guided cues, those that we've learned and we're carrying out from memory, supplementary motor area. There's your gross oversimplification of motor units. But those three collectively we're going to think of as our motor cortex. There's the primary, and then there's the association. More granular information, which direction should we move a specific body part, and then a slightly higher level information. What's the order that we should operate in? What's my visual and auditory input telling me? What have I done before? Do we have any questions? All right, let's go through these.